Thanks to all of you for coming. I'm Steve McInerney. I'm the Executive Director at POMED, the Project on Middle East Democracy. On behalf of our organization and the Heinrich Böll Foundation, which is sort of co-sponsor of this event and also of this report that we're publishing today and this project more broadly looking at U.S. assistance to the Middle East and North Africa and the impact on democracy, governance, and human rights in that region. We're pleased today to be publishing this report. This is the seventh consecutive year that our organization, in conjunction with the Heinrich Böll Foundation, has published this report. Each year we try to examine publicly available budget documents, including the federal budget request from the administration, that's submitted from the administration to Congress each spring. And then we also supplement that with discussions with administration officials, staff up here on Capitol Hill, as well as a variety of voices outside of government, both in Washington and across the Middle East and North Africa, to try to paint a picture of not just the budget numbers and funding levels, but also more broadly what those things tell us about priorities, trends in terms of how the U.S. government is viewing the Middle East and North Africa and engaging with that region. In conjunction with this, the report's release, we're pleased to have a discussion today. In addition to my colleague Cole Bockenfeld, who's our Advocacy Director and co-author of this report, we're pleased to have two speakers here to comment on the report. In addition to getting this started, I'm going to, in just a moment, Cole and I are going to give some remarks on the main findings of the report. Then we're going to turn to our two guest speakers, Lauren Craner and Amy Hawthorne, to comment and give some of their reactions on some of our findings and conclusions. Just briefly, Lauren Craner, we're excited to have him here. He has a long career in supporting democracy and governance globally. That includes serving as the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor during the Bush administration. He also served for many years as the president of the International Republican Institute. He is currently the co-director of the Transatlantic Renewal Initiative of the World Affairs Institute, and he also serves on the board of directors of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And Amy Hawthorne, who's going to be our last speaker and commenter today, is currently resident senior fellow at the Hariri Center for the Middle East at the Atlantic Council. She also has a long career focusing specifically on U.S. policy in the Middle East. Before joining the Atlantic Council, she was an appointee at the State Department, where she focused on the State Department's response to a lot of the upheaval over the last few years, particularly in Egypt. Prior to that, she was the executive director of the Holling Center, and she also was a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. With that, I'm going to begin to talk a little bit about this report and some of our findings this year. As I mentioned, this is the seventh consecutive year that our organization has published this report. It's the seventh year that I have either authored or co-authored this report. Initially, I would say that in many respects, this is one of probably the grimmest and sort of bleakest report that we've published in the 7 years that I've been working on this report. We always try to make a real effort in this report to sort of be balanced and point out both the positive and negative in terms of signs for U.S. support for democracy, governance, human rights in the region. I would say that the positive signs are probably fewer this year than have been true. Certainly they've been true since before the Arab Spring uprisings in 2011, and quite possibly the fewest sort of positive signs that I've seen in the 7 years that I've been doing this. I think for a lot of us that focus on and are interested in U.S. support for democracy and governance in the region, there was a lot of excitement naturally in 2011, not only excitement about what was happening on the ground in the region and the potential that these dramatic and historic uprisings would bring about positive change and progress and democracy in the region. I think there's also a lot of excitement and hope that the events in the region would spur changes in U.S. policy, changes that people like myself and our organization had been pushing for quite some time before that. 3 years later, I think, just speaking frankly, I think the reality is that those changes have not taken place. I think that one of the things that's remarkable in this year's sort of our examination of U.S. funding and assistance for the region is how little has changed since before the uprisings of 2011. And a lot of this report we framed in terms of sort of comparing back to that pre-2011 period. A lot of the comparisons that we do in charts and graphs in this year's report sort of use 2010 as a benchmark, looking not so much just how things have changed over the last few years, in the last 1 or 2 years, but where are they now compared to where they were before the sort of dramatic political changes that began to unfold in the region. And frankly, I think it's a bit shocking how little has changed. In one sense, I think it's also, this is maybe the first year that it's become easier to sort of make some of these comparisons. I think when the revolutions erupted in 2011, the administration was caught off guard and had to sort of scramble, and it sort of takes a few years. I think, we understand the sort of long-term nature of a lot of the budgeting and assistance processes, and it takes a bit of time to kind of adapt to things. Over the last couple of years, in 2011, 2012, there was a lot of scrambling and pulling money from different accounts. Now a lot of that has settled, and I think it's pretty surprising to us the overwhelming degree to which the U.S. Assistance package and funding for going to the Middle East and North Africa looks, very, very much like it today, like it did before all of this in 2010. If I maybe direct you, I don't know if everyone had a chance to pick up the report on the way in. If you did, I would direct you maybe to look at a couple of the pie charts that we have on page 5 of the report, and I'll just briefly sort of comment on that. Page 5 is sort of breakdown of assistance going to the region, to the Middle East and North Africa, broken down according to the State Department's strategic objectives. The top pie chart is for the current federal budget request for fiscal year 2015. The one below it is the breakdown for the spending in 2010. What you can see is how remarkably similar those two graphs are, and what small differences there are. I mean, if you look at the graph from 2010 first, you see that the majority of assistance going to the region was under the peace and security objective. Essentially, this is assistance to support military and security operations. That was 73% of funding in 2010. Today, it's actually slightly more at 76%. If you look at the red piece, funding to support democracy and governance programming was 7% of all assistance to the region in 2010. There was a lot of rhetoric in 2011, 2012, both from the administration and from Congress about the important need to kind of shift and adapt and respond to these changes. But today, the level of funding to support democracy and governance is 6%, so it's slightly less than it was in 2010, despite lots of speeches and rhetoric and announcements and declarations about how democracy and governance was going to be a higher priority, was going to be no longer a secondary priority of U.S. policy toward the region, but a top priority. The reality is, in terms of funding and allocation of funds, it's actually a slightly lower percentage of the funds to the region. The other two categories for supporting economic growth and investing in people, you see, are roughly the same as they were as well. If you would like to turn the page to page 7, I think these two bar graphs also from the current budget request for 2015, and then also from the last year, actual spending from the last year before the uprisings in 2010, I think just at a glance, you can see how remarkably similar those two graphs are. And this is sort of, the height of each bar in this graph represents the overall level of assistance to each country in the Middle East and North Africa. This is bilateral assistance given to these countries. Within that overall bar, you can see that the portion of the bar that's gray is for military and security assistance. The red is for sort of economic and development assistance, including political development or democracy and governance assistance. And you can see the first thing I would note is that the first 6 countries, the 6 largest recipients of U.S. assistance in the region, are the same today as they were before the uprisings. And not only the same, but in the same order, and very little change in terms of the levels of assistance. The most significant change here on this chart is you'll see Syria on the top chart. where you will not see it on the bottom. Obviously, the Syrian government and the Assad regime were not recipients of U.S. funding. Of course, they're still not today, but the administration has allocated bilateral funding to Syrian opposition groups and also humanitarian assistance and development assistance, both to Syrians inside Syria and also to Syrian refugees that have had to flee the country. Other than that, essentially, the countries that are getting assistance today are the same ones in the same order as they were 3 years ago. I'd point out three countries that sort of are off to the right side of each of these graphs, those three being Yemen, Tunisia, and Libya. Those are three countries that, as you all know, are undergoing political transitions that were sparked by the uprising in 2011. I think there's been lots of discussion and rhetoric from the administration about what important priorities it is to support these transitions, but I think the reality is that the top priorities in the region are sort of maintaining the bilateral relationships that this administration has and previous administrations have always maintained. And there was a lot of discussion in 2011, including from now Secretary Kerry, who then, of course, was here in the Senate, about the need to respond by adapting assistance to the region. There was discussion about the need to rebalance the levels of military assistance and to sort of increase the levels of economic development assistance and political development assistance, democracy and governance funding. That has not happened. There was a lot of talk about sort of the importance of these transitions and transitioning countries, but you can see that sort of the biggest, and I wouldn't oversimplify. I wouldn't say that the level of funding in of itself encapsulates everything about U.S. engagement with particular countries, but I think it is a realistic descriptor of the degree to which these countries are priorities, and I think unfortunately very, very little has changed. I think that if someone who had never looked at U.S. assistance to the region were to see these numbers for the first time, the current level of request, I think it would be a little bit surprising. I think the best explanatory factor in terms of where countries are in terms of levels of funding is not so much need or importance in terms of what's happening now in the region. It's really where have they been for years or for decades, and that's very much where they are today. I'll point particularly to Tunisia as a case that I think is extremely disappointing for those of us who are supportive of democracy and governance in the region. Tunisia is the one country that over the past 3.5 years, has made really remarkable progress, important historic progress in its transition to democracy. They, in January, completed and finalized and passed their new constitution. They're set up to have elections later this year under that new constitution. On one hand, the administration has, in recent months, really in the last 6 months, spoken a lot about the importance of Tunisia. And in our section, there's a section of, we have country sections for 11 countries in the region in this report. In a section in Tunisia, we sort of have a handful of quotes from administration officials. On lots of occasions, lots of different high-ranking officials have, in the last 6 months, described Tunisia as a top priority, as an important model for the region. They've spoken at length about the importance of supporting Tunisia, but the reality is that we're not really doing so, or we're doing so on a very modest scale. The current budget request for Tunisia includes is for $66 million. 36 million of that is for military and security assistance. That leaves 30 million for economic and development assistance. 20 of that is for a particular fund, the Tunisian American Enterprise Fund, that was set up a couple of years ago to support Tunisian small businesses, although as of a month or two ago, it had been yet to actually disperse any of the funds. I think also comparing back to the pre-revolution, Tunisia before the revolution under Ben Ali received about 20 million in assistance annually from the United States. So on one hand, the amount has increased from 20 million up to 66 million. On the other hand, it absolutely pales in comparison with the demands and the needs that it's facing. I think most of us in the democracy and in the kind of democracy promotion community who think that democracy and the emergence of successful democracies in the region is extremely important, feel like Tunisia should be seen as an real historic opportunity for the United States, for European countries, for anyone that wants to see the emergence of genuine, stable democracies in the Middle East and North Africa. Getting Tunisia right and providing it the support that it needs should absolutely be a top priority. And the plain reality is that it is not. And there has been, as I said, lots of rhetoric to the fact that it is a top priority, but it hasn't at all been, backed up. Just say briefly a few words about a couple of other countries that are similar. Libya, I think, is in a similar situation in many respects. It's received very little assistance. I think it's also been plagued by sort of the ongoing fallout of the attacks in September 2012 that killed U.S. Ambassador Chris Stevens. It's also plagued a little bit by this idea that Libya doesn't need assistance because it's an oil-wealthy country. And while Libya does have lots of oil wealth, the reality is that because of the fighting and instability in Libya, oil production has decreased 90%. And the reality is that while in the long term, if Libya is stable, it will not be dependent on assistance. In the short term, it does need aid. And I think it has suffered from a real lack of international support following the overthrow of Gaddafi. The final remark I'll make at this point is one of the few more positive examples in our report this year is Yemen. I think Yemen is a country where the U.S. has admirably, shifted its attention toward the importance of supporting the political transition in Yemen, supporting the national dialogue. I think there are. But lots of Yemenis have criticism for particular tactics that the U.S. is taking in Yemen. But I think it is clear that these issues of the political transition are now a real top priority of the administration. If you'd look quickly at the bar graph on page 38 in the Yemen section, that for each of these countries we have a graph that shows the breakdown of assistance to the country overall, and the trends from fiscal year 2009 until today. I mentioned that overall for the region, support for democracy and governance programming is currently at 6% in the current budget. For Yemen, that fraction is at 37%. And I think that's admirable and appropriate. There's lots of discussion. Of course, Yemen is an important country in the fight against terrorism and Al-Qaeda. But I think there is a recognition in Yemen that this fight against terrorism cannot be done through military and security tactics alone, and that in the longer term, defeating radicalization and terrorism must be done through support for stable democratic governments and successful democratic transitions. And I think that has been sort of appropriately identified in Yemen. If you look at the funding for the GJD objective or governing justly and democratically, it's essentially the State Department's categorization for democracy and governance funding. If you look at the bar graph there on page 38, you can see how consistently over the last few years, as Yemen has gone through this difficult transition, the administration has steadily increased funding to support democracy and governance and to support that transition. And I think that these two graphs that you see on this page, if you look through other parts of the report, sort of starkly differ from the graphs for most other countries in the region. And I think this Yemen should be sort of a model for the appropriate response during this kind of period. So with that, I'll turn to Cole to address some of our other major conclusions.
All right. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for coming. We're very, of course, excited to have this report. We feel this year that in many ways is one of our strongest reports with the most sort of new information and most thorough sort of background information, both from the publicly available content, but also the interviews we've conducted with so many officials involved in these questions, and we hope it's especially useful to those of you on the Hill that deal with these appropriations questions. I wanted to just jump right in. Steve talked, some broader framing on the region, but also some country-specific issues. I want to pull you back out just a little bit to talk about some of these sort of broader thematic findings of the report that we viewed as sort of good indicators of the administration's approach and policy toward assistance to the region this year. In many ways, a lot of the comparisons that Steve made were back with 2010 and the sort of excitement for change after 2011 that I think a lot of us had hoped for from the administration after the uprisings in the region. One of the key signature responses in 2012, sort of in response to the transitions underway in the region, was the creation of a new fund, or the request for funding for a new fund called the Middle East and North Africa Incentive Fund. It was a big $770 million fund that was designed to both respond to the transitions currently underway, but also to provide financial incentives for those regimes that had not seen dramatic upheavals take some of the courageous steps toward reform that were long overdue. That fund didn't receive congressional support in both 2012 and 2013 and was not funded. And we view that primarily, we talked about this more last year, but we view that primarily as a product of a lot of confusion and lack of information on the administration, purpose, goals of the fund, what kind of programs it would go to, what kind of countries would be targeted, and so on. But also that there wasn't sort of a high-level, full-court press by the administration to sell the fund on the Hill, which is absolutely necessary up here these days for anything of that kind of dollar amount, I think. And so what we found this year is that the administration has sort of shifted its approach, and that in many ways the incentive fund model has been abandoned for a new $225 million fund called the Middle East and North Africa Initiative Reform Fund. This is sort of a different kind of approach in a few ways. In one respect, the administration sort of responded to calls, especially from the Hill, to be more clear about what kind of programs this fund is designed for, rather than just a big, open, flexible kind of pot of money. And in some ways, they took steps in that direction and divided this $225 million into 5 different sectors, or 5 different kinds of programming, including encouraging private investment in the region, water security, regional economic reforms, democracy and governance, and also human rights and rule of law programming. But on the other hand, we found that the approach of this fund is largely shifted. Where before the administration was seeking to respond to the transitions underway and also incentivize reform, this new MENA Initiative Fund more closely resembles a traditional development model, sort of long-term development in the region, especially working on things like private investment, on water security, and so on. We find those to be very worthy goals and very worthy sort of long-term programming for the Middle East and North Africa over the long haul. But in general, we find it very loosely tied to political reform, that the portion devoted to democracy and governance and human rights, about $55 million, is not the main thrust of the fund, and that they're sort of backing off this push to more strongly promote political reform in the region. And finally, this new fund would be administered by a new office within the State Department. It's known as the Near East Affairs Office of Assistance Coordination. This is something we had raised in last year's report, there were some stirrings and conversations about a new coordination office at the State Department, and especially the integration of MEPI, the Middle East Partnership Initiative, into that office. With this year, we've sort of gotten a lot more information exactly about what that office looks like, what its goals are, and its structure. So I want to talk a little bit about that, because we found that more than any other component of this report, that this was the place where there was a lot of confusion and suspicion and not real clear information on exactly what's happening with this new office. Just by a little bit of background, there was an office set up in 2011 after the uprisings in that year to sort of coordinate assistance to the countries in transition. About 2 years later, after Ambassador Ann Patterson had taken over as Assistant Secretary at NEA in the State Department, This sort of office was expanded to oversee not just assistance to the countries in transition, but all assistance to the region. And that essentially there should be a one-stop shop to coordinate all kinds of programming that emanates from USAID, from State Department DRL, from MEPI, from lots of other actors and donors and mechanisms involved in the region to bring them all together to better coordinate that policy. One of the steps that we found unusual, though, in this coordination role is that there's a sort of formal incorporation of MEPI into that office, and that on one hand, we found that it makes sense to coordinate assistance to the region to make sure that there's not overlapping or duplicative programming. That it's a bit odd, from our perspective, that one of those donor arms that you'd be coordinating is within that office, and that all of the others would be outside that office. And that actually some staff within the office would sort of wear two hats in coordinating assistance, but also administering assistance. The second sort of shift with this new office and the effect it has on MEPI is with its leadership. Traditionally, MEPI has been led since 2003 largely by political appointees. People generally with strong track records promoting democracy and reform in the region, and that not only serve to administer the kind of assistance to the region on those issues, but are also strong pro-reform voices within the State Department on policy issues. Now with this new office, the leadership has sort of reverted to a more traditional NEA diplomatic figures. It's now led by Elizabeth Richard, who worked with Ann Patterson in Pakistan and also reports to Jerry Firestein, until recently was the ambassador to Yemen. And we find with this shift that we're worried that only a sort of strong political appointee and a strong independent voice that doesn't have the same sort of restrictions as a career diplomat within the State Department can be a sort of brave and courageous voice for reform within the department, and that perhaps under the new leadership, may be less independent and maybe less willing to take risks and sort of push as strongly on reform as they had in the past. Another main finding, or a third main finding I want to talk about more broadly is what we found to be the administration's sort of decreased support for civil society across the region. And as all things with this report, it's not just about the numbers, but also about the policy. If you look at the number, and again, using the comparisons of 2010 to today, and using comparisons, of course, what our policy looked like before the uprisings of 2011 and what it looks like today, the funding to civil society in this year's request is lower, 35% lower than it was in 2010. In addition to the sort of lower spending levels, we also find sort of backing off of the political support for funding civil society across the region. I'm sure most people in this room remember the very high-profile crackdowns on NGOs in Egypt. There's also a strong pushback in the UAE on U.S.-funded NGOs. And really, since that time, we've seen the administration decreasing its willingness to fund unregistered organizations and less willing to do those kinds of activities out of a fear that it may antagonize some of the host governments. One of the things we were especially alarmed by in our research, and only discovered this because we very carefully scrutinized the administration's request and all the accompanying appendices. And one of the appendices that comes out every year with the sort of budget request is also suggested appropriations language to legislatures of the kind of language the administration would like the appropriators to consider when they're writing the law. And in that appendix, there's actually a suggested removal of what's known as the Brownback Amendment. It's often referred to as Brownback, and basically it says that the U.S. funding for democracy and governance groups in the region shall not be subject to prior approval of foreign governments. This is a provision of law that in one form or another has been in place since 2004, essentially in reaction to Mubarak-era restrictions on NGOs in Egypt, where the Mubarak government was trying to, and very successfully for some time, limit U.S. funding to NGOs in the country. So we're very particularly alarmed that the administration is suggesting that this clause in the law be removed. We find that this is sort of indicative and sort of confirms a lot of fears that the administration is less willing to sort of support civil society in the face of pushback from host governments. I'll just briefly make a couple quick points on Egypt. I know I said I would focus on the regional things, but I think Egypt, especially on the Hill, is a really important issue to discuss. What we've always said with this report, I think we've said for several years running now, that every year it changes a lot, our analysis, and depending on the administration's moves. But one thing that has stayed constant for 7 years now is the Egypt section is the longest. It is always the most complicated, always the most hotly debated, and this year is no exception. What we found this year is that there's sort of broad recognition of the need to overhaul the Egypt assistance package. There's sort of broad agreement that it's an outdated construct that doesn't either sort of meet the current needs of Egypt, but also doesn't give the U.S. the kind of leverage it needs over Egyptian officials. And despite that sort of broad agreement, we haven't really seen any major results, any substantive changes to the aid package. It's surprising how much it's stayed the same, how much it's maintained consistency, despite the fact that Egypt today is a dramatically different place than it was just a few years ago. We found in our interviews and discussions for this report that there is some growing recognition, particularly on the military assistance, that there is a need to reform, especially the mechanism by which Egypt aid is delivered, known as cash flow financing, but also the contents of the assistance package. In short, there's a recognition that Egypt's security needs today, in terms of border security and counterterrorism, are not very well met by another 100 tanks or another dozen F-16s, that we sort of need to change the kind of things that the FMF buys to meet those security needs more accurately. But the big question is, will the political will be there to make these changes, even though there's a sort of growing agreement on these? As Steve mentioned, in 2011, there was a sort of broad agreement and broad discussion on the need to rebalance the aid package, to increase economic aid to Egypt, to decrease military aid perhaps. But we didn't see that. And so the question today is, will the administration, sort of within the administration and also its role with Congress, be able to take the very difficult but long overdue and needed steps to reform the aid package? With that, I'll conclude and let Lauren take over.
Well, thanks, first of all, for the invitation to be here today. Let me congratulate the Project on Middle East Democracy, Steve, Cole, and POMED staff for another job well done. I've watched POMED as they've grown from an idea to one of the most respected and knowledgeable voices on events in the Middle East, particularly the discussion of democracy. The turnout here today and the report being unveiled, their 6th annual report on U.S. democracy funding, shows why POMED is so well thought of. The report, which has been refined every year since it was first issued, is a very even-handed and I think objective portrayal of relevant regional events and the U.S. response. For example, the report's lengthy section on Yemen notes that the administration has responded thoughtfully to changing circumstances there, which I think is very accurate. As POMED's report puts it, the U.S. government has sustained significant efforts to support Yemen's humanitarian and long-term development needs since the beginning of Yemen's transition in 2011. Later, the report states that Yemen represents the best example in the region of the administration steadily increasing and adapting the assistance package in response to political changes on the ground. And as Steve noted, the bar graph on page 38 reflects the thoughtful changing nature of the administration's support since 2011. Yemen stands out, unfortunately, in large part because it is an exception to the administration's approach. Amy will detail our approach to Egypt, where remarkably our aid package has barely changed from the days when a former general was elected in questionable balloting and may have contributed to a return to such a situation. Other examples of failing to respond to enormously changing circumstances are outlined in the report. Tunisia is, according to many administration officials, a top priority. According to President Obama, the United States has a huge investment, this is a quote, in making sure that Tunisia's experiment is successful. But you wouldn't know it from the amount of assistance Tunisia receives. As the report says, it appears that the administration has chosen to demonstrate its commitment by having numerous high-profile officials repeat remarks about how important Tunisia is, rather than demonstrating its commitment through tangible commitments commensurate with the country's being a top priority. Another example of the difference between speeches and action is Libya. Our role in the country's revolution was a high point in this administration's foreign policy, for which President Obama rightly deserves credit. But remarkably, again, there has been little follow-up on his achievement to ensure a successful transition. This year, the bilateral aid request is for just $6.5 million as Libya struggles. What comes through most clearly from the disparities in approaches outlined in this report is the lack of a durable strategy and follow-up on speeches when it comes to the subject of Middle East democracy. A number of people have remarked on the fact that an opportunity was missed these past 3 years to catalyze liberalization in the region. I think I'm the oldest person on this panel, and I'm old enough to remember a similar opportunity arising in the wake of the 1990 collapse of the Berlin Wall. Steve mentioned that I worked for Colin Powell, but I also was a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs for Jim Baker in those days. One day I was up in these halls listening to members and staff up here saying that the Cold War was over, there was a recession beginning, and their constituents wanted a peace dividend and didn't want to hear about any aid to countries like Poland or Lithuania or Georgia. I returned to the State Department where I ran into my boss, the Legislative Affairs Assistant Secretary, conversing with a guy named Bob Zellick, who was then a State Department Undersecretary, and a guy named Dennis Ross, who was then Baker's head of policy planning. I told them about the earful I'd gotten on the Hill, whereupon my Assistant Secretary reinforced me, saying she doubted that any aid to Central Europe could get past the Hill. Bob and Dennis responded by saying how the collapse of the Soviet Union was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to foster democracy and free markets in the former Soviet bloc, and that we needed to press hard to find leaders in Congress who would expend the political capital to back assistance, and that when we did so, we would have the consistent support of Secretary Baker and President Bush 41. The resulting SEED program had support through the Bush 41, Clinton, and Bush 43, and now Obama administrations. It wasn't easy. Bulgaria, Slovakia, Romania, Serbia, Georgia, and others took a long time and a lot of effort, and it hasn't been completely successful. Vladimir Putin can attest to that. But for millions throughout the region, in places like Poland and Slovenia, and the Czech Republic and Macedonia, many more, a U.S. strategy, a durable strategy, backed by steady funding and implementation over many years has made a huge difference. Any effort to follow up on President Obama's laudable May 2011 Middle East speech, promising that after decades of accepting the world as it is in the region, we have a chance to pursue the world as it should be, that's a quote, was short-lived, ending just 2 years later, in the summer of 2013, when, according to an October 26, 2013 New York Times headline, National Security Advisor Rice offers a more modest strategy for the Middle East. In the article, Rice states that President Obama thought it was a good time to step back and reassess how we conceive the region. The Times story notes that Rice's approach was a scaling back of the more expansive role Mr. Obama himself articulated 2 years ago in his May 2011 speech. So far, the administration has missed an historic opportunity to help change the region, as President Bush 41 did, in a durable strategy that was adopted by the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations. Such an approach might well involve spending more. At the same time, our involvement and the costs of the Iraq and Afghan wars are decreasing. We might also have tried to make common cause with some of our wealthy friends in the Gulf to help open up the region. Now, the administration still has time, 2.5 years, to outline a strategy and do some implementation equal to the opportunity in the region, one worthy of adoption by their successors. Given the historic nature of what we're witnessing in the Middle East, I hope that next year's POMED report can recount the story of an administration which has seized that opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. Amy?
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank POMED for inviting me to speak on this panel, and also join Lauren in congratulating you on an outstanding report. This report does two things very skillfully. It provides the big picture, and it provides a lot of crucial details. And as we know, the devil is in the details when it comes to foreign assistance, and this report is chock full of important details that I think you have uncovered and brought to our attention. So congratulations. And I'd also like to say that it's a pleasure to be on this panel with Lauren. I've had the honor of working with him in different capacities, when he was at IRI and when he was heading up DRL, and we're all very grateful for your contributions to the crucial work of democracy promotion around the world. I want to say a few things about Egypt, U.S. assistance to Egypt, and then a few comments on the bigger picture, how I think the administration is sort of looking at all these questions in the region writ large. Regarding Egypt, to build a bit on what's in the report, and the material and analysis that you guys have provided is excellent. I would say this is a very troubled U.S. assistance program. It's one of the most well-known and long-standing. Both the military and the economic side has been going on for, I think, about 35 years now. But it has reached a point where there are many questions surrounding it. There are certain aspects of this troubled assistance relationship that are very specific to Egypt. The U.S.-Egypt assistance relationship is very complex in a way that I'm actually not sure that any of our other aid programs in the region are. But the challenges that we're facing in Egypt, I think, also apply to some of the challenges in other countries in the region, so it's worth looking at closely. First, it is remarkable the extent to which the fallout from the NGO funding crisis of a couple of years ago continues to plague the U.S. aid program, economic aid program in Egypt, and even to make democracy promotion efforts funded by the U.S. More difficult in other countries in the region. I think most of you are familiar with this crisis, but briefly, a couple months after Mubarak's ouster, the Obama administration decided to use $65 million, mostly from the bilateral aid program. This is the bilateral ESF program that the U.S. provides for Egypt each year, for democracy promotion activities in Egypt, and not just democracy promotion activities, but mostly for direct grants to U.S. and Egyptian NGOs and civic organizations. The Egyptian government strongly objected to this for a number of reasons, the most important one being that they didn't support these kinds of activities and didn't want them taking place. And these NGO workers ended up being put on trial. 43 people were convicted almost exactly 1 year ago by the Egyptian courts, including, I think, 14 U.S. citizens. This was a disastrous episode in U.S.-Egypt relations and in U.S. democracy promotion efforts in Egypt, and it's had very negative effects in other countries as well. Because the lessons, I think, that the Obama administration took away from this episode were that it's not worth it. It is not worth it to go out on a limb and try to push the envelope and fund some of these groups. By the way, all these groups are very well known, and they're all legal, both in Egypt and in the United States. Some were not registered under the NGO law that the Egyptian government wanted, but they all had legal status. The U.S. was not funding any illegal entities. But I think the conclusion from many people in the administration of this bruising episode was that it's just too hard, it's too difficult, it's too risky to support these kinds of organizations when there's a huge pushback from the host government and a very negative public reaction as well. There were a lot of people in the Egyptian public who also opposed this funding, and that it's just too hard. And so what we need to do is just kind of back off, not inject large amounts of funding, be very cautious, be very careful with our D&G assistance, and really think twice about whether it's worth it to do something that is kind of this going against the grain, one might say. That has brought most of the D&G programming in Egypt to a halt, except for some programs that are working in areas that the Egyptian government is comfortable with. And it has also, I think, seeped into the ether of how the U.S. government looks at these kinds of questions, funding NGOs, funding civil society groups in other countries as well, and has contributed to a real reluctance and a real sense that it's just not worth it. I mean, if you ask someone in the administration, they're not going to say that directly, but that, I think, is kind of the underlying thinking about this. So that episode, which really was triggered by an assistance decision, continues to have very negative implications, and it's never been resolved. The way that the U.S. and the Egyptian governments have dealt with it after the conviction 1 year ago was essentially just to try to move on, turn the page, move on, and leave that in the past. But it remains unresolved, and it sort of haunts a lot of these assistance questions. The second observation I'd make about the aid program to Egypt, the economic portion, is it is not clear to me what the purpose of this aid program, what is it for? What is the U.S. trying to do with this money? What is the strategic goal that these resources are trying to advance? In the Mubarak regime, largely speaking, I would say the money was designed to, in some respects, support the Mubarak regime. Now the U.S. has a very different relationship with the Egyptian government, so are we using the funds to support the incumbent government? What is it about? It's very unclear to me, and I would just call your attention to the discourse of the administration, which frequently talks about the Egyptian people, that the United States stands behind the Egyptian people, we support the Egyptian people, we're aiding the Egyptian people, which I think is exactly the appropriate policy goal, but it's not clear to me, and more important, it's not clear to a lot of Egyptians how this money is advancing that goal. Most Egyptians have no idea what the aid program is doing, how these programs are benefiting ordinary Egyptians. There are some individual programs that are being funded in Egypt that are very valuable and very worthy, but they are almost invisible in Egypt. So to me, this is another huge question. What is the strategic purpose of this aid program, and why do we need it, and what is it accomplishing? And are we using these resources as effectively as we can? Third, it needs to be said that often with our aid programs in Egypt, our economic aid programs, the government of Egypt is actually a very difficult partner, even though this is a bilateral aid program. Even on issues or areas where the Egyptian government wants the support, where we agree on what the priorities are, they're a difficult partner, and that has there are many reasons for that. A lot of it has to do with Egyptian sensitivities about receiving U.S. aid. If you talk to Egyptian officials, they have plenty of very legitimate complaints about our aid program, but the bottom line is we don't have a strong partner in the Egyptian government. I think it's time that we actually start acknowledging that and thinking about how to structure our aid differently. Finally, on the military side of the aid relationship with Egypt, which is really the bulk of the money, $1.3 billion that has been constant, I believe, since 1987. That level has not changed. There's a positive and a negative to what's going on with our FMF program in Egypt, in my view. On the positive side, the U.S. did decide to withhold a chunk of military aid last fall to sort of signal its displeasure with violence and mass human rights abuses in Egypt. This was a very controversial decision, but the bottom line is that even though the U.S. is still suspended, the aid is still suspended, the Egyptian government has not improved its human rights performance, but the sky has not fallen. So keeping here these large weapon systems that the U.S. and the Egyptian governments always said was crucial to Egypt, that they have F-16s and tanks and Harpoon missiles and Apache helicopters. It's been at least 10 months since these systems have not been delivered to Egypt, and I think it's hard to really see the impact, that there's a devastating negative impact. And the reason why I think this is positive is because this FMF relationship has been on autopilot for years. It's needed to be restructured. It's needed to be carefully looked at. It has almost been impossible politically to open up that black box and look at what it is that we're funding and whether it really meets Egypt's current needs. Does Egypt really need more fighter planes to address the legitimate security problems that it's facing today? So in this sense, I think it opens up actually the possibility to have a constructive conversation about what the military aid is really for and how we can target it better to serve our interests and also meet Egypt's real security needs today. The downside or the risk with the FMF, in my view, is that recently the Obama administration has started to talk about restructuring a lot of that funding on the FMF side into more counterterrorism related activities. And while this could potentially be useful because that kind of assistance might better meet some of Egypt's current needs, it also poses a lot of risks for the United States. I think we can imagine what they would be, that we would get very, very deeply drawn in to a counterterrorism campaign that is both addressing Egypt's actual terrorism problem as well as going after peaceful political dissidents and other opposition forces whom the Egyptian government designates as terrorists and the US government does not agree. So this is full of perils for the United States. And I think as we restructure our military aid relationship, we need to think very, very carefully about how these funds potentially would be used for counterterrorism purposes. And here I would say this is a crucial role for Congress. Congress needs to be asking these tough questions. Senator Leahy is asking some of them, but there need to be other voices. I think we can find a way to work with Egypt constructively to address, as I said, their legitimate security needs without getting drawn into basically a mass political crackdown that the US taxpayer dollars would be funding. This is in no way in US interest. So that would be a note of caution. Briefly, in terms of the bigger picture, if you look at, on page 5 of the report, sort of the macro level funding picture, that the total request is $7 billion. 76% of that is for military and security related assistance, and 5.8 is for democracy and governance programs. I think that kind of says it all. In some cases, there is a disconnect between US government rhetoric, what US government stated priorities are, and assistance. In this case, I actually think there's a very close alignment. If you look at what President Obama has been saying recently and his top officials in his administration, he actually makes it very clear that the US priorities in the region have to do with security, not with the human, political, and economic development of the Middle East. So in this way, I would say that the assistance request is quite closely aligned with what the administration actually says that it wants to do in the Middle East. Now, many of us have questions about whether those are the right priorities and whether we're heading into a situation where there's too much of an imbalance between these two sides of the equation, and whether, it's possible for the United States to stand for something more in this region than security, and particularly to stand for something more than our own security, but also the future of the people for the region. To me, this is a huge question. Within the non-security portion of the assistance that the U.S. is providing and wants to provide to the region, as we know, most of that smaller portion is focused on economic priorities, economic issues. And while I would very much agree that improving economic conditions in the region are crucial to the region's future, I would say that it's not enough. There's sort of now kind of a talking point going around Washington that I hear more and more, that the uprisings of 2011 were caused by young people who didn't have jobs. That's a vast oversimplification of what has caused the discontent in this part of the world. Yes, of course people want better jobs, don't we all? But it's a much more complex situation than that. There is definitely a political dimension to people's discontent. It's easier, I think, for the United States and for Europe to sort of try to downplay that part of it, because it seems somehow like it's easier to address the economic part of this discontent. But that shouldn't lead us to kind of ignore these other questions that are going on and these other these other factors that are potentially destabilizing the region. And I would submit that really the major factors that are going to shape the future stability of this part of the world, which is so crucial to the United States, it is so important to our interests in so many ways, really has not so much to do with external security, but I think it really will be largely shaped by two things: how governments treat their citizens, how Arab governments treat their citizens, and how Arab citizens together figure out what it means to be a citizen. So if you have an Islamist and someone who's not an Islamist, how do you come up with a framework that accommodates different rights, different priorities, living together peacefully? These issues were among the ones that caused the uprisings in 2011. And if unaddressed, they will just continue to create waves of unrest, waves of instability for years to come. I would feel more comfortable if the US government, whether Republican or Democratic, were taking that future more into account and thinking about how we as outsiders can try to address those problems a bit more effectively. So that's kind of a bigger issue that really concerns me as I look at how we're engaging with the region. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amy and Lauren. At this point, I'd like to open up to the audience for any questions regarding the report or the issues that have been addressed so far today. And if you could please wait for the microphone and just briefly identify yourself, your name and affiliation. Yeah, we'll start right here.
Alani Patel from Vital Voices. Thank you so much to POMED for trying to put some structure and analysis into what's happening in the government. We all, I think, know in this room that the Middle East has the greatest global gender gaps in economic participation, political and public leadership, as well as a continuing violence against women problem. I'd like to hear if you found any substance around women in your analysis and in your research, as well as more about the intra-regional connections and what did you find there?
Hi, Nell Sheelan from George Washington University. I just wondered, it seems kind of interesting that Yemen policy does reflect kind of a more thoughtful taking in of the changing situation. I just wondered why we think Yemen kind of looks more promising and nowhere else does.
How do you see the incoming budget pressures on the Defense Department impacting our assistance policy to the region?
Okay, I think we'll respond to those and then we'll come back for another round. Maybe I'll start on the question about women and U.S. support for women's rights and empowerment and political participation in the region. A couple of thoughts come to mind initially. One is that I think support for women has been an important part of U.S. programming, especially the first two places that come to mind are in Tunisia and Libya that are going through transitions. MEPI and USAID both have programming to support women's candidates for political office, women's role in NGOs. When I was in Libya last year, I sat in on a U.S. government-funded training for women's candidates in upcoming elections. I think in those two places in particular, I think it's been a strong emphasis of U.S. support and programming. I think it's also, those are both also countries where there's a pretty clear desire for such programming. Tunisia has a long history of sort of women's organizations and some of the first women's rights organizations in the Arab world. I think also there have been some really impressive successes by women's civil society leaders in Libya. So those are the first couple of places that come to mind where there's been, I think U.S. support has been important and there's a real focus on that side. On the other side, maybe somewhere something that comes to mind that I would say is negative is that in general, we talk a little bit about this in the report, that in general, in the Arabian Peninsula, the countries of the GCC, the 6 countries of the GCC, in general, U.S. support for civil society or democracy and governance programming in the GCC states has diminished. Those are, all 6 of those countries are oil-wealthy countries. They're not countries that have large assistance programs or U.S. aid missions. These countries have been priorities, including for women's rights. They're obviously countries in which women's rights are a major concern, a major issue. This had been a priority for DRL and for MEPI. I think, frankly, I mean, Amy talked about the sort of NGO crisis and the fallout from that in Egypt. One of the places that there's really been a sort of fallout in that regard also, and I would say also a fallout of what's happened in Egypt, is in the Gulf. And this idea that the U.S. government thinks that it's too hard or not worth the risk to push in terms of rights programming, I think is very evident in the Gulf, and the Gulf is one of the places in which this work on women's issues was most important. And so I think there's been a decrease in these kind of programs, not just women's programs, but women's programs were very important in the Gulf, and I think that the U.S. is sort of pushing less and doing less to support those kinds of things in the Gulf. I'll turn to and let others respond to some of the other questions. So.
Maybe I'll just pick up from there. I'd also just add on briefly to this question that another place that we did find a good emphasis on incorporating women into programming was Yemen. And in particular, a sort of strong emphasis the past 2 years on inclusion of youth and women in the national dialogue process, but also going forward. Now that that process is concluded, there's a recognition that on one hand, there was very good steps taken and sort of big issues discussed and some major proposals agreed on. But now those proposals need to be implemented. This is the hard part. And indeed, in this sort of next phase, that women and youth also need to continue to be incorporated into that implementation process. Maybe with that, I'll also just say a few words on the second question of why is Yemen more promising? For a few reasons, we feel like there's sort of broad political support within the administration for Yemen's transition. On one hand, I think the administration is very rightly pleased with the progress made by President Hadi and his government on some of the very difficult security sector reform issues, the military reorganization, and so on. That is very sort of very long-term, difficult, major changes that had to be made in Yemen's political structure for its transition to succeed, and that coupled with the sort of progress made in the national dialogue process are very positive steps forward. That for the first time the country had sort of a national conversation on some of the most difficult issues and came to some real consensus of how to move forward. I would caveat that slightly in that, we've also found that the security restrictions in Yemen for U.S. personnel, we feel maybe sort of may give the administration an overly optimistic view of the next steps ahead. And we feel like the Southern question in particular is a key indicator of this. While on one hand, the progress in Sana'a and the national dialogue was very positive, it's unclear if those in the South with strong push for secession there are willing to accept that process or feel like that process is meaningful and inclusive of them, and will they support the implementation, for example, of the new federal system that came out of it. I'll leave it there.
Let me just stress 2 points. First, on women, I think Steve and Cole have outlined, with much more knowledge than I have, what is being done. One of the things that I think is a real shame, and we were guilty of this in the Bush administration too, is there's a lot of talk about empowering women overseas, but not a lot of money dedicated to it. I remember Paula Dobriansky, who was my undersecretary for global affairs. If she wanted money for a project involving women, she had to come to me and take money from my Human Rights and Democracy Fund, which fortunately was growing, and I was more than happy to spend it. But it just seemed to me that in an administration where we're emphasizing that, and I know the same has happened in the Obama administration, that you ought to put money where your mouth is. There has been for some years an idea kicking around the Senate side Appropriations Committee of having a $10 million fund dedicated to political participation for women. And I know they're marking their bill up soon. But if any of you are interested in that, I would urge you to talk to your or the member of Congress or the Senate who is devoted to that. Very thoughtful points on Yemen, why it's different. I'm going to say something that might sound kind of weird, but I do think that it is important that other agencies beyond state and AID have been involved, DOD for starters, in Yemen. I think that other agencies learned a lot about this kind of work, about work with civil society, about bringing women and youth into the process, about being inclusive from their work in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I actually think that it's kind of counterintuitive, but I actually think it is helpful that other departments and agencies have been involved in Yemen and see a need for some of the things that are being done out there.
In terms of the question about the defense budget and fiscal pressures, I guess what I would say is that the overall budget environment, as we know, continues to be very difficult in this country, and the Defense Department is in the process of making, very painful cuts to its budget. I think the way in which that affects this kind of programming is that it really has to do with the choices that the administration is going to make about what it wants to fight for most. And in that regard, I think that foreign assistance, which has, as we know, is never incredibly popular on the Hill, will possibly get less attention in this overall struggle to kind of protect certain resources and make tough decisions on others. President Obama, in his May 28th speech at West Point on foreign policy, announced the intended creation of this $5 billion fund to help governments around the world counter terrorism. And this is something that, from what we can tell, would largely be composed of funds that are basically coming out of the DoD budget. And so I think that will be something that the administration will be, I would expect them to push hard on new appropriations and new authorities to create that fund, and that may end up just taking up a lot of bandwidth, and then defending some of the smaller things that are mentioned in this report may get less attention. So I think in that sense, it's it continues to be a very difficult environment for funding anything. I guess in that regard, I just make one more comment. One of the things that surprised me the most during my time at the State Department, after working on assistance programs and D&G programs on the side of the implementer for a long time, and then moving into the place that was making the decisions about the funding, was how little questions of effectiveness, of aid effectiveness, actually played into funding decisions, and how little actually Congress also was asking tough questions about which programs really work. This really surprised me. I think there are many reasons for it, but there are evaluations done of all of these programs. Some of the evaluations are more sophisticated than others, but there is a body of knowledge out there about which programs are successful and which ones are less so. But that pool of information usually didn't feed its way into assistance decisions, and it usually didn't feed its way into discussions with Congress about what was being funded. This was very, very surprising to me, especially in such a difficult funding environment where it's our tax dollars. We really should be making sure that what we're funding has a chance of success. I don't expect that to change anytime soon. I just note that as an observation.
Okay, thanks. So we'll return to another round of questions from the audience. We start here in the front.
Like GW University. There's another budget, the Coastal Exchange Fulbright Hayes money, which rightly and normally is not included in discussions of development assistance, but a lot of those programs address the same issues, have impact on those same audiences, and I wonder if it might not have been a useful thing to include some kind of an annex or a reference to those other activities in your report.
Just here.
Mark Hankin, Solidarity Center. I noted your comments about the prescription that these uprisings were in part caused by young people without jobs. So the question is, has the administration in this proposal or earlier proposals modified the types of economic support programs that it is now implementing to address those issues? I might have some differences in how I interpret that, but that's another discussion some other time.
I want to bring up a pretty controversial question, but I was wondering, it's pretty clear on the page 5 how much money the US invests in Israel. And I was wondering if you think if that doesn't hurt, for example, its relationship and other development plans with the rest of the Middle East.
And just next to you.
Yeah. And I don't know why I'm standing up, but I'm just curious if you could touch upon Syria and Iran funding, Syria especially with regard to it going to the opposition and the unknown political futures there, and Iran just with the challenges of programming Iran funding. Thanks.
Sure. So I think maybe I'll start with that last question on Syria and Iran. We note in the report in the section on Syria, I mentioned earlier that there is, a sizable amount of funds allocated specifically for Syria in the budget. This is the first year for which that's the case. The fiscal year 2015 will not be the first year in which money goes to Syria, but it will be the first year that in their budget request they asked for money for Syria. Over the past few years, they've been sort of taking funds from various multi-country accounts and trying to sort of mobilize some funds to respond to the sort of rapidly changing and deteriorating situation in Syria. As far as support to the opposition and such, I do think there have been a lot of criticism that a lot of this support has been slow to come, and that the assistance to Syria is focused largely on humanitarian assistance, which is very important, but sort of overlooked the importance of sort of building up moderate political forces inside Syria or in exile. This budget request, of course, everything that's requested, will take quite some time before it's implemented. Congress will not pass this budget until the end of the year. But this request does include a sizable increase in funding for this side of political development work in Syria, a total of about $84 million. So I think it sort of demonstrates an interest, and I would expect this is an interest that will receive support here on the Hill in the administration, sort of ramping up that kind of activity. We know there are many critics that would have liked to have seen this happen more quickly. Overall, the amount of funding requested for Syria is about double. It's $155 million, which is about double what was spent in the last fiscal year, which they'd pulled from various sources. I would also mention that this strategy of initially responding by sort of mobilizing funds from different accounts and then sort of adapting that by building up the bilateral account that we've seen in Syria and we've also seen to a degree in Yemen is one that I think we're a bit mystified as to why we haven't seen take place in Tunisia or Libya, where there's been continued reliance on sort of mobilizing funds as though the transitions were unexpected. 3 years later, it's not as unexpected. On Iran, the funding for Iran, we have a section in the report that looks at a program called the Near East Regional Democracy Program. These funds are used primarily to support pro-democracy actors, Iranians, either inside Iran or outside. There's no specific bilateral allocation for Iran programming. As you all know, it's difficult to carry out the kind of democracy and governance programs that are done in other countries. In Iran, it's illegal, according to Iranian law, for U.S. activities like that to take place inside Iran. There's a strong focus, in this program in supporting access to information, including online through the internet. Also in providing opportunities for Iranians to attend programs and conferences and such outside the country. I will say that this year's budget request in that Near East Regional Democracy account includes a little bit of a shift in emphasis to address more explicitly and overtly political issues, including support for political activists and civic education about elections, which is something that had not been as much of a focus of that previously. Overall, in the grand scheme of things, I would say that the support for that kind of programming related to Iran is relatively steady. Of course, we'll see how things continue to unfold with the negotiations with Iran on the nuclear issue, which could, potentially have a dramatic impact on funding or programming for that country. As far as other questions that were asked, on the question of aid to Israel, certainly it's not changed for a long time that Israel is by far the largest recipient of U.S. assistance both in the Middle East and not only in the Middle East and North Africa, but globally. We don't go into much detail of that assistance in large part because none of that assistance is to support democracy and governance programming. It's entirely, 100% of it is for the military. It's had a large-scale military package in place, since the late 70s, around the same time that the package was established for Egypt. Certainly, I think there's no hiding the fact that, U.S. Relationship with Israel and support for Israel has an impact on its relationship, with other states. But I also wouldn't, overstate that. I think it's also the case that the U.S. It's not that the U.S. is sending lots of funds to the Arab countries. And as far as, from our perspective and looking at democracy and governance and such, I think a lot of the sort of animosity towards U.S. funding in the region is not only for funding to, maybe animosity in Arab states or funding to Israel, but also towards, continuing to fund non-democratic, repressive, authoritarian governments across the Arab world. And I think that remains the case. I'll turn to others to address the other couple questions.
I'll just say a few things on the economic question from Mark. I think a few things did change after 2011 in terms of the economic approach. A couple of things that were sort of taken from the page of Eastern Europe primarily. One was the introduction of these enterprise funds for the region, that there was a sort of recognition, again, to improve economic conditions and the need to fund small and medium-sized enterprises to do so. Unfortunately, as Steve mentioned with Tunisia, this was also set up in Egypt and in Jordan. And I don't believe any of them have sort of begun to disperse any of the grants. I think they're still in very early stages of setting up their boards and internal bylaws and so on, so it didn't really have the immediate impact I think it was intended to. Another common economic tool that we've seen over the past few years is loan guarantees. We've seen 2 loan guarantees to Jordan just within the past year and a half of $1 billion and $1.25 billion to support and help the Jordanian government address the economic strain it's under. We've also seen this was one of the sort of only major new initiative for Tunisia in the past 6 months. Was the signing of a $500 million loan guarantee to that government to help them deal with it. Other issues, I think, on the economic side, interesting to look at are in Egypt. There has been a move, and I don't think this should come as a surprise. Before, a lot of U.S. economic assistance often went to direct budget support for the Egyptian government, almost a cash transfer. With the large influx of Gulf money serving that purpose, the U.S. economic assistance is no longer needed in that sphere. And then just one point also that we found really interesting in Egypt this year is there's a huge backlog of economic funds being held up in Cairo, several $100 million that the USAID mission simply been unable to spend due to a combination of political volatility and programming, but also the crackdown on NGOs, which makes administering that very difficult. And so this was actually one of the reasons this MENA initiative fund was sort of justified as saying, if we have economic support in a flexible regional fund, we won't be as dependent on host government cooperation and sort of difficulties and political volatility that we'll be able to react and be more agile with that funding.
Sure. Just to add to your question on economic issues and job creation, young people without jobs, I think as everyone in this room is pretty familiar, the really critical problem in a lot of these countries is not just unemployment, it's underemployment. It's educated young people who can't find a job that is commensurate with their skills or often with their aspirations. I think that the U.S. has tried to address this issue in various ways. There are a number of interesting interventions or initiatives, assistance programs across the region trying to get at this. I don't have a clear sense of how successful many of those have been. I would just note that we struggle in this country with our own unemployment problem and with job creation in this country. It's actually a very, very complex issue. I think it's even harder to do it when you're working in a completely different culture and society and political context. But the bigger picture, I think, is that the U.S. has really struggled in responding to the transition countries in particular with whether to use our resources to kind of help these governments stabilize their fiscal picture, the sort of the macroeconomic situation in order to just prevent the bottom falling out from the economy, or whether to use our assistance resources to kind of get at issues of job creation and vocational training or promoting economic reforms that are needed. The U.S. has tried to do both. It's tried to do both. In Tunisia, we've seen trying to respond to both challenges. But it's very difficult, especially because the governments in these transition countries aren't really sure what policies they want to pursue to address these long-term problems. And so often I have seen, really actually innovative programs funded by the U.S., but not a strong government partner on the other side, simply because the host country government is in disarray and trying to figure out, whether the minister will be in office this week or next week. So it's very, very challenging area, I think, for our aid.
I'll just comment briefly on your sort of comment on education programs and exchange programs like the Fulbright-Hayes. In general, I think our perspective is that those kind of programs are important. Generally, in terms of funding levels in the Middle East and North Africa, I have the impression they've been relatively stable, relatively consistent. We do acknowledge in the report, we think those are important, but we also think it's very important at the same time to be kind of funding the sort of more politically oriented programs that are trying to push the envelope. Cole talked a little bit about the Middle East Partnership Initiative and the Office of Assistance Coordination within the Bureau of Near East Affairs. Frankly, we describe in the report, and Cole, mentioned this a little bit, sort of the deterioration of MEPI and its role on the political side. I would say one thing that I think they're continuing to do well is some of these kind of exchanges. And I think they have important programs that they're continuing to carry out. And we've interacted with a lot of participants in these programs from across the region. I think they're very, very positive programs that are viewed positively. And it's something that MEPI is continuing to do well, but unfortunately, we feel like MEPI's not playing as strong a role on the sort of political side and influencing policy and being willing to, push governments and support independent actors that host governments may be less happy with. We'll return for another round of questions from the audience. We'll start right up here in the front, please.
Hi, I'm Dom Margiata. I'm the Aid Data Fellow to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I just want to say thank you to all of you for taking the time to speak with us today. I know that a very large State Department account, at least generally speaking for a lot of countries, is their global health programs, and I didn't see those mentioned anywhere in the context of the Middle East, and I was curious as to why that was.
Thanks. I'm Brian Dooley from Human Rights First. In 2010, European countries would have had a different set of aid relationships with the Middle East than the US would. But I wonder, do you have an impression over the last few years how the EU has adjusted to the new Middle East and whether it's done a better job of adjusting its support compared to the US?
Other questions? If not, we can take those too. Okay, I'll start. The question on global health programs, I think there are some important programs that focus on health in the region. I would say it's a lower percentage of support and assistance to the Middle East and North Africa than it is to numerous other regions. Most notably, I think Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, which has a lot of these larger scale global health programs. Yemen comes to mind as a place where health programs have been an important part of the assistance. There's been an increase over the last few years in support for health programming in Yemen. There's also been some health programs in the region that have been damaged by difficulties in working with ministries of health, as we've seen rapid turnover and changes in government and ministries, including health ministries. Egypt comes to mind as a place where a number of the programs that have been in place for some time in Egypt are sort of on hold. Cole sort of mentioned this backlog of a lot of economic aid to Egypt. That includes some of the health programming that has not been able to be implemented. In general, I think health programming is seen as important, especially in some of the countries in the Middle East that are sort of on the lower side in terms of general level of economic development. But of course, in our region, in the Middle East, there are a lot of countries that are reasonably reasonably wealthy and have maybe better health conditions than in poverty-stricken countries, but still need serious help on the political development side. In terms of the EU and how they've adapted or not, better or worse, frankly, I mean, obviously our kind of overall assessment of the U.S. response is pretty bleak and pretty negative and pretty critical. Frankly, I would say it's roughly equally so of the EU. I think the EU has also been sort of timid in its response, timid in its support, on a country-by-country basis, there are some differences. The EU has tried to play a little bit different role. In general, the EU has been a little bit more active in the countries that have had the historically stronger relationships, which in some way mirrors, what we're saying about the U.S., that the ones with historically stronger relationships remain so. The EU has been more active in North Africa and the countries of the Mediterranean, less active, in somewhere like Yemen. A lot of these are criticisms about sort of, inability to adapt, I think apply to the EU. I was in Brussels a couple of months ago and had a lot of meetings, and it's a lot of the same kind of debates and discussions that we have here. One thing I would say is that I think there's maybe a bigger split or divide between what you hear from the EU and European Commission and the External Action Service and the European Parliament. I would say that there are a lot of members of European Parliament who I would say may be more active and more concerned with what's happening in the Mediterranean countries and North Africa than members of Congress. Here, of course, you have another factor, which is sort of that the different individual EU member states have their own policies and approaches. I would say in general, the more northern European states, particularly Germany, has been sort of played an active supporting role. I think Germany is perceived as having a particularly positive role in Tunisia. We hear this a lot from Tunisians, that the German embassy and the German ambassador there has played a very important role in encouraging political negotiations. I think in general, the more southern European states, Italy, Spain, have been sort of slower to embrace, changes. There was this big speech by Catherine Ashton in which she promised, these 3 M's, markets, mobility, and money. And it's sort of the southern European countries that would sort of have to give this kind of access in terms of markets and mobility. And I think there's been a lot of reluctance there. I think the northern European states that perhaps are a little further away from what's happening, less likely to be impacted by large, swells of immigration or effect on their own markets, have been in general more supportive or more willing. It's easier politically for them to be supportive. But overall, I think that the picture is not that different in Europe from what we see here in Washington. Anything else? Amy?
Sure. I largely agree with what Steve said on the EU response. I've taken a look at this myself as well. The EU, largely speaking, I think has a lot more aid resources than we do, so they're a very important player in that regard. Generally, I would say that they have tried to make some changes in the way that they engage with these countries and what kind of assistance they're offering, but I think it's met with limited success. And one of the big challenges I think that the EU has faced is that they've tried to take the kinds of incentives that they've offered with great success in Europe to encourage countries who want to join the EU or be part of the European family in one way or another. Those have been very attractive incentives. They've had a much harder time offering those things to the Arab uprising countries, for lack of a better term. And so they, as one EU official told me, we're trying to sell something that people don't want. The kinds of things that we're offering, trade agreements and other things just aren't what these countries are looking for right now. So I think there is some soul searching going on still about about the mismatch between what's being offered and what is being demanded and needed on the receiving end. I think they've done some things a lot better than the U.S., and in some ways they've been less innovative. Briefly on the question on global health, I think you asked it. I think it just made me think about something with respect to Egypt, which is that this gets again at the dilemma for the United States of figuring out what our priorities in Egypt are, what should we be using our assistance resources, a country that's facing so many problems, which ones are we going to try to help them solve out of the long, long list? And just to give a sense of how difficult the environment there is, Egypt is now facing, a number of very serious public health problems that it really wasn't facing 3.5 years ago. So even with all the problems that existed in Egypt on the eve of the revolution in 2011, Egypt has now slid backwards in many, many, many development indicators. And I had a long conversation with the U.S. aid mission when I was out in Cairo a few weeks ago, and they're alarmed at the deterioration in a lot of public health issues and the potential for diseases that people did not think were coming back to Egypt and had been eradicated, the potential for these to come back in. So this just gives a sense, I think, of where does the U.S. focus its attention and its resources? Does it focus on those issues? Does it focus on encouraging some of the economic reforms that are needed systemically to try to change the whole system? Does it focus on training youth? I mean, there's a lot of hard choices to make because the situation in Egypt is getting much worse, even than it was on the eve of Mubarak's overthrow. So, and health issues are a big part of that, unfortunately.
Just a short note on Europe. I think the characterizations of EU aid that have been made are really apt. I do think if you look at what is going on in Brussels, the Parliament will begin to take on more and more authority. And while some people in the Parliament who were big proponents of democracy work overseas, like Edward Macmillan Scott, were thrown out in the last elections, I still think that others in the Parliament who are interested in these issues are going to have more and more power, and they're anxious to exercise it.
Okay, we have time if there are one or two last questions. Otherwise, we will conclude here. Okay, well, thanks very much. Oh, are there? I missed someone. Right here.
Hi there, my name is Rachel, and I'm an intern at the Lebanese Information Center. And in your report, it says that there's going to be a reduction of the democracy and governance programming in Lebanon, and how do you think this will affect the country, especially in its current state where the political future is right now unknown? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I will, I mean, it is true there's been a decrease in funding. There are several sort of long-running U.S. government-funded democracy and governance programs in Lebanon that have come to an end within the last year and a half or so. I do think this is problematic, something we should be worried about. I mean, I think, frankly, as the crisis in Syria has escalated, I think it has sort of translated into more of a focus, first and foremost, on the security side in Lebanon, and there's a lot of concern here in Washington about basic stability in Lebanon. I think, unfortunately, it's a mistake to kind of overlook the importance of continuing efforts to build pluralism and forces that can play a positive role in Lebanese politics. Obviously, there's been a lot of difficulty in kind of basic political stalemates in Lebanon. So I think this is sort of a mistake and short-sightedness in this cut. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add.
The only thing I'll briefly add is I think this example is sort of consistent with some of our other criticisms in that John Kerry, of course, was just in Beirut and talking about the importance of electing a president and the importance of getting a political structure in place because of all the pressures to do so. But it sort of stops at the rhetoric, that we don't see a sort of continued assistance policy in particular to make sure that can be sustained.
Okay, well, thanks very much to all of you for coming, and thanks very much to Amy and Lauren for joining us and commenting on the report, and I look forward to seeing you all next time.